This is Changing the Coalfields, a podcast by Coalfield Development. I'm your host, Brandon Dennison. I also serve as the CEO of Coalfield Development. And this week's really cool. We have a friend and a colleague named Thomas Watson. Thomas is with a group called Rural Support Partners, who I have interacted with in a variety of forms and functions throughout Central Appalachia over the years. So we're going to dive into that. And Thomas, are you also the founder of Rural Support Partners, if I remember correctly?
I am, yeah. I am the founder. We 13 years now that we've been doing this. This sort of what I would call a mission-focused management consulting firm. And that mission is to help drive the new economy of Central Appalachia, just as the Coalfield Development, just doing it from a capacity building and infrastructure building sort of standpoint.
Good deal. And tell us a little bit, while we're on the topic, maybe some examples of the work that RSP has done recently that you're excited about.
Yeah, well, I see our role as really helping to strengthen the leaders and the organizations and the networks who are advancing the new economy. Right. So we most of our work focuses with nonprofits and foundations and state agencies, federal agencies, small town government sort of things. All the folks who are out there in all kinds of different iterations helping to create the new economy. Our job is to help them become more efficient, more effective, and ultimately more impactful, which helps move our mission forward. Right. And so we do everything from strategic planning to evaluation to executive transitions to network management, teaching, training, coaching, all the good things you would think that a good management consulting firm would do with those type of organizations. But we focus it almost wholly on groups who are working on community economic development in Central Appalachia. So we try to keep it in that ballpark. And with the long-term goal of really helping to strengthen that infrastructure, strengthen and connect that infrastructure of leaders, organizations, networks who are moving the new economy forward.
Leaders, organizations, and networks, and anybody who's active in community development in Central Appalachia usually knows RSP. So you've done a lot of work with the Appalachian Funders Network, a lot of work with the Central Appalachian Network. You helped start a fellowship program, if I remember correctly. A few years. It's honestly, it's inspiring, Thomas. The fingerprints of positive change that you've left throughout the region. It really adds up to quite an impact.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm very lucky, very early on. And I'll tell you this story, how we got connected with the CAN and then the Funders Network and just how that work started. So, I had this vision of doing the kind of work that we've been doing for a long time. We were brand new. I'd started RSP and we'd had some few clients starting with Appalachian Sustainable Development. Actually, our first client was the executive transition of Anthony Flacaveno, which is really, in my mind, the grandfather of the sustainable ag movement here in Central Appalachia. That's where we first met ASD. That was our first client. And so I knew about CAN, the Central Appalachian Network, through ASD and through Anthony, and had followed that work. Had myself been trying to build networks and been part of networks for many years before this. And I heard that CAN had a coordinator, and I heard that coordinator was leaving. And that coordinator at the time was embedded in MESID, which is now Mountain Association. And so I also knew that CAN was having a little gathering up in Southern Ohio, up in Nelsonville. I'd never been up there before. But it was by invitation only. So for 2 or 3 weeks before that, I called everybody I knew to try to weasel in an invitation to this CAN gathering. Didn't have any money, literally went into debt to rent a car to get up there. Didn't get there till 2:00 in the morning. Got locked out because, it was at Nelsonville, at a hotel. They didn't have anybody there. I couldn't get into my room. I didn't get in until like 3:00 in the morning. Oh. And the next day, it was a great gathering, by the way. It was really early in CAN's work. They were doing a lot of work around food. And I knew Justin Maxon at the time slightly. I didn't know him really well, but I knew him enough. And again, just trying to position myself. And I got a seat beside him at lunch. And I said, "Hey, Justin, I know that CAN is looking for a new coordinator. And boy, we'd love for y'all to consider us for that job." And he knew me just enough to say, "Wow, I had not thought about you, but I bet you'd be good at it." And so he set us up with an interview with the rest of the steering committee. And they decided to take a chance on us. And that was a very important time with CAN because it up until that point, it really had been a learning network, learning and sharing. But all of a sudden, CAN had gotten a lot of money from the Ford Foundation. That they'd gotten a $600,000 to $800,000 grant to do local food value chains. And as a network, they had never worked together at that level to produce collective outcomes and track data and have collective plans. And so that was our first entrance into CAN. And so it was our job to really help to create the framework that really led into a lot of powerful work on the local food side of CAN, and that sparked a long career. Now almost 12 years as we're stepping out of that role. Almost 12 years with being the backbone support of the Central Appalachian Network. So fascinating journey.
All these years I've known you, I had not heard that story. Actually, the 2 a.m. in Nelsonville. That's quite the entrepreneurial sprint.
It was. I had if I'd had any idea how long of a drive it was, I probably wouldn't have done it. Actually, it's like an 8-hour drive up there from Asheville in the middle of the night. So it was quite a trek. But then that opened up the window. As the Appalachia Funders Network began to get started. About the same time. It was a lot of visionary work between Sandra Mickish at the Babcock Foundation and Mary Hunt up at the Benedum and Ray Daphner at ARC. And at the time, the Ford Foundation, Wayne Fabish had a great program officer. And they had this notion that funders should start working together. And in 2010, they held a meeting over in Abington, brought about 30 funders together to really look at what was happening with the economy. We had just gone through that major recession, and Appalachia had been declining. Coal had been declining, manufacturing had been declining for a long time. And then, the bottom just fell out further than anybody thought. So they were really trying to figure out what was happening with the economy and what should funders be doing about it. And this is when all of this economic transition work was really taking hold, coming out of Maysid and Justin Maxon's vision and out of KFTC and others in Kentucky. And so that notion really took hold with that meeting in 2010. And they came out of that meeting with a vision of the Appalachia Funders Network, and they created a small steering committee. And then they hired us, because we'd been working with CAN. They liked that kind of stuff. And they hired us about 10 hours a week to begin to help envision what that network of funders would look like and how it might work. And then we played that role for 10 years as well, and really helped build out the structure of that thing and really help to understand what funders could and couldn't do together over the years. That also was an unbelievable opportunity. And then try to create synergy between the two. During those years, we had Sandra Mickish kind of playing one foot in both worlds. And so it was a fascinating time, 2010, 2012 or so.
So you've been a player in positive change throughout this region. I'd love to go back to the beginning. I've heard some great stories from you. You're born and raised in Southwest Virginia. Tell us where you grew up and what your parents did and where you went to school.
Yeah. So I did. Galax is my hometown, still my hometown, my heart. I've been in Asheville since the late 90s or so, but Galax is it for me. It's a great place to grow up. My dad had 11 brothers and sisters, absolutely the epitome of Appalachian poverty. I mean, growing up in, 2-room shack and no shoes and hungry and, just a tough upbringing for those folks. And, but they're also hard workers and had a good reputation. And many of them, especially my uncle's side, became entrepreneurs in the 70s. My dad ran a couple of furniture stores and clothing stores. One of my uncles owned the car dealership, the other owned the junkyard, and one owned the body shop, one owned the mobile home shop. So, I grew up in a set of entrepreneurs and farmers and factory workers, right? That was my entrance into life. I started working in the store, very early on in my life. It was an interesting experience. And then, after high school, did exactly what most folks did in high school. I had no vision, barely made it out of high school. So went to work in the factory. I got a certificate in welding and went right to work as a production welder. Did that for about a year or so and got laid off. I got laid off from my first job when I was 19 and it was crushing. I had no responsibility, still living at home. But it was soul crushing, to feel that feeling not having a job and being let go of a job that I actually liked and paid well. And I literally the next week I went to work at the glass factory where my papa worked for about 40 years. But I saw the writing on the wall, that the manufacturing was leaving us, and that was what was happening at the time. Galax had about 35 factories in those days, back in the early 80s, and glass, furniture, textiles, but they were one by one, leaving Galax. And I was very fortunate at the time. I had a girlfriend who was in community college, and I kept talking about the need to do something else, but had no vision, didn't know anybody who'd ever gone to college or anything. And she says, well, why don't you do something else? And I was like, well, what else would that be? Right. So is there another factory I can go to? Like, that would be better than this one. And she connected me to Whitfield Community College, and they took me in. And honestly, I couldn't put a sentence together when I walked through the door of Whitfield Community College. It's one of the most important pieces of infrastructure I think we have in Central Appalachia is that entrance in the college through the community college system. They can take you wherever you are and help you get out the other side of it. And so that was the first step, into something new and different and focused on management, and was very fortunate to come out of that. That opportunity, I'll stop after this one, but that opportunity, I worked at the Holiday Inn while I was in community college. And when I finished, I parlayed that 2-year degree into a management training program with, it was a small hotel management company that moved me to Greensboro and opened up the door. I had a great boss there in Whitfield at the Holiday Inn. I had a great boss at the Holiday Inn in Greensboro. And that second boss connected me to to Guilford College, which then opened up a whole new world for me. So this notion of bringing young people along is key. I mean, it was, I was lucky I had a girlfriend who was connected to college. I was lucky I had a boss who cared enough to actually help me get on the right direction. He even called my mom and encouraged her to let me go to Greensboro because nobody had ever left Galax, and I had a good boss in Greensboro. So that stuck with me all my life and really tried to open up doors for young people and others along the way. So,
Shows. My mom's was a community college teacher.
You're kidding me.
But so I appreciate the shout out to the community colleges.
I think it's one of the most important pieces that we have. I've often envisioned, boy, I'd love to be a president of a community college, what power you would have to help, open up doors for folks like me, man. How many folks don't get that experience and that opportunity? It was the life. It was, there's pivotal moments, I think, in everybody's life. And that was a major pivotal moment for me of being able to walk through the doors of Whitfield Community College. It opened up the rest of the world.
So growing up in Galax, what'd you do for fun on the weekends? If you're comfortable sharing.
Yeah, it was a good idea. Ride country roads and drink beers about what you do for fun in Galax. I was lucky. My uncles had a bunch of land on the New River, and so I spent a lot of time on the New River. Spent a lot of time fishing and rafting and camping and enjoying the river itself. It was a great place to grow up. I didn't realize how great, at the time, but that was it. And then at the time, Galax had a main street, and I had kind of an antique car. My family being in the Ford dealership and things, we all valued cars a lot. So I always had a nice car, and did a lot of cruising, man. Did a lot of cruising Main Street.
Love it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
You and I've talked a lot. I mean, growing up in Appalachia, there's so much to love and to celebrate. It's an authentic place. It's a unique culture. Saturday nights at the racetrack, grandmas who can quilt.
You got it.
Grandmas garden and hunt and glass blowing and making and creating. But when we talk about change, there's a lot that also needs to change in Appalachia too. How have you sort of struck that balance over the course of your life of loving family and friends, exactly as they are, and loving Appalachia as it is, but also wanting to see some things that need to change and being willing to speak up and push it where you can?
Yeah, boy, it's a good question. you know, from a big picture perspective, and you know this better than anybody. I mean, I think you're the one plugging this gap better than anybody I know. But, you know, when I was growing up, man, that factory infrastructure, my mom spent her life working at Hanes, right? She was a sewer. She worked really hard. But she had good pay, but more importantly, she had a family. I mean, they had a softball team. They had, you know, big summer picnics. I mean, she felt like she was part of something, right? She felt like she was part of a bigger something. Even when I worked in the factory as well, like it was part, you know, I felt support. I felt it was part of my family. I had purpose. You know, even though I didn't have a big vision, I felt like I was doing stuff that was important to, you know, to the world. And as those factories began to leave Galax and coal and other places, we didn't just lose jobs. You know, what folks lost was purpose, and they lost dignity. I mean, getting laid off at 19, I felt worthless. I couldn't imagine what it felt like getting laid off at 40 or 50 and have 3 kids at home, you know? And so, you know, what's happened is that the loss of our economy has created the loss of vision and purpose and dignity in so many people. And starting in the late 80s, what began to happen there is that something pretty bad began to take its place, and that was drugs. It was first meth, and then it was the opioids, and now it seems like it's back to meth and fentanyl, even worse stuff. And that, you know, that in itself is an easy fallback when you don't have purpose and vision for yourself. It fills a big void. It fills a big gap. And then that begins to erode the family and erode the community. And that's where a lot of communities and a lot of places find themselves these days. Especially a young guy like me now coming out of school. If I was coming out of high school now, there would be nowhere for me to go. And the easiest place for me to go would be down the route I just described, right? I had a place to go when I left high school. I didn't have any vision or didn't know what I was going to do, but I had an automatic place to go. And that doesn't exist in so many places. And so, you know, part of what's happened with me is that I was very privileged to be able to step outside of that. And I think it's up to all of us to open up those doors for others to do the same. I mean, all of the work that Coalfield is doing is such a great example of that. You're opening up doors and opportunities for folks where there is no door. You know, we have no bridge from high school or from the last layoff to whatever's next, you know. And I think that's some of the most important work that we can do, because once you begin to feel that personal power and dignity and have some vision, man, the world's, you know, wide open. But until you feel that, honestly, you're not going to go very far. When you don't feel worthy and you don't have vision, then you're going to get stuck pretty quickly. And I think that's all of our work. And I think Coalfield is such a great example of that. When I was at your celebration recently, and just the graduations and the pathway and the bridge that you're creating for folks is some of the most important things, while also creating some jobs and opportunity, you know, at the same time. It's an amazing work.
I appreciate it. So you got, you said Guilford College, you went from community college, Holiday Inn, Guilford College. So what was the next move after that?
Yeah. Well, you know, boy, Guilford opened up a whole world, right? I mean, that was the place where I really had to begin to, I think 2 things were happening at that moment. You know, I was coming alive. I got to Guilford, and then Guilford just opened up incredible opportunities to think. And then I started volunteering in Big Brothers and Big Sisters. And I had a young brother, a biracial kid, lived in an African-American community. And, you know, he was already in trouble. I was working with the more harder kids there. It's what I was really wanting to do at that time. And boy, just opened up my whole world there, you know, and I came out of Guilford. I became a banker. That was my next move, and managed a branch of banking for Wachovia. But I kept this volunteer work up, and then they opened up opportunities for me to work in the schools and teach in the schools and stuff as a volunteer. You know, the bank encourages to do stuff like that. So it's great. And so I was about 3 years into the banking career, and I started looking at my journal, everything in my journal was about my work with these kids, and there was nothing in there about the bank, right? And frankly, the bank was just a sales job. It was a selling credit to people who didn't need credit to start with, and anybody who did need credit, there was nothing I could do for them. And so I just had this reckoning that the banking wasn't really for me, and what I really wanted to do was pivot and work with kids like this and open up this door so that other people had opportunities as I had myself. And so I left the bank and went to work in a wilderness camp where kids would come, instead of going to jail, they'd come spend a year in the woods and get a lot of counseling and a lot of support and years with the high school. And what I saw in that camp was that, man, these were tough kids in tough situations who were heading to jail. And once they got to camp and they had a community that was positive and supportive, and they didn't have to worry about the money coming in or drugs in their community or peer pressure, man, those kids turned around 100%. It was unbelievable the change that would happen from when they would walk into the door and 6 months or 6 weeks after they were in the program. And so, but the problem was I had to send them home, right? And I'd send them home every 6 weeks, and they would come back out of whack again every time I'd send them home, right? And so I began to think about this notion, like, man, I was going to be a teacher, right? I was going to springboard from that to go back and teach. And so I saw very clearly that, man, these kids needed a good teacher, but what they needed was a better school system. And what they needed was their parents needed more money. And what was needed is that drugs needed to get out of the community. They needed an after school program. They needed to stop being oppressed by, all of these adults who just looked at them as they were losers, right? And so one of the most fortunate, again, people in your life. My partner at the time was the last fellow at the Babcock Foundation. And I got invited to a board meeting. They had a dinner at one of their board meetings. I got invited, and I sat down beside Gail Williams, who was the director at that time. Never met her before. And I was so fired up about this work. It's really embarrassing to say this now, but I talked her face off at that night at that board meeting, right? And it was all about this stuff. I was like, I was just so trying to understand, like, how do you create an environment for these kids to thrive? That was the big question, right? And she said to me, well, people do work like that, right? And I said, what do you mean? What kind of work do you mean? And she said, it's called community development and community organizing. And she said, wait a second. She just did this to shut me up, I'm sure. She said, wait a second. She walked in her office and she gave me the book of Highlander. She gave me the Seeds of Fire, the Miles Horton story of Highlander. Wow. And I read it in a week, and I came back to her and I was like, this is what I want to be doing. How do I learn how to do this? Right. And so, and I ended up in graduate school at Chapel Hill in a master's program in social work with a focus on community development, community organizing. I was lucky. I had a couple of professors there who had been in international development and had been organizers, and they let me literally create a program tailored to fit me. And that got me down the nonprofit path. So, and then Sandra, Mickis at the Babcock Foundation, and Gail were core mentors to me forever, and really are responsible for so much of my thinking, and Highlander as well. I mean, all of that stuff that came out of Highlander. I was lucky. I met some folks at Highlander when I was in graduate school. Helen Lewis, who was really Miles Horton's right-hand woman, and for many years, and she got me up to Highlander. I ran some of their summer programs while I was in graduate school. Just a transformative experience. So came out of there, graduate school, really as an organizer, and fired up to do the kind of work that we've been doing ever since.
Incredible. And of course, Babcock was one of the very early supporters of Coalfield Development, and it's how I met my wife, Ashley. So it's amazing. Well, one thing leads to another.
I remember Ashley well, and I remember Sandra Mickis telling me many years ago. She said, you got to pay attention to this guy, Brandon, up in Huntington. Man, he's got some really great stuff. You need to figure out a way to connect with him. And so I remember that very distinctly. I got one more step of this story to kind of bring it all home, and I'll tell you what it is. So when I finished graduate school, I was very justice oriented sort of fellow at that time, really on fire, like a lot of young people should be. And I moved to Minneapolis. My partner at the time went to graduate school up there. I'd never been out of the South. So we decided to take a chance. And I really became a very in-your-face organizer. I mean, hardcore organizer, right, around affordable housing issues. At the time, Minneapolis had a massive affordable housing issue, 300% increase in child homelessness, a real land grab of the city. We're going to tear down 900 units of affordable housing, of public housing. And they were moving all of the folks in those affordable housing out to the first tier suburbs, wouldn't let them use vouchers in the city. And they were going to turn that into the yuppie side of town, right? They were going to turn it into getting all the white folks to come back. And so myself and an organizing partner of mine, Neva Walker, who went on to be the first African-American woman in the House of Representatives for the state of Minnesota. Wow. We were the organizers tuned to do something about that, right? And so we literally were knocking on doors in public housing. We started the Northside Neighbors for Justice. It was a group of public housing residents. We were doing meetings in 5 languages. It was Hmong, African-American, African, Spanish. You know, it was fascinating. We built a big group of African-American churches around the Northside Neighbors for Justice, and we literally fought the city. And we fought the city on affordable housing issues and the demolition of this housing in Minneapolis. And all of this work accumulated up until one day, and we were building a big following, man. We were getting good press, and we were building a pretty robust group of folks around this stuff. We were trying to stop them from moving people out to the suburbs. We were trying to stop the demolition before you built back housing because there's nowhere for people to go. We were trying to get policy passed for new money and this kind of stuff. And all this work accumulated up until one day, the city was going to demolish 40 units of housing. And they announced it on a Tuesday, and it was going to happen on a Wednesday. And so we held an emergency meeting the night before, and we said, hey, we just got to show up. We had no plans to stop it or anything. We just wanted to bring attention to it and show up the next morning. By 10 o'clock that next morning, we had about 150 people on that site. Keith Ellison, who's now the Attorney General of Minnesota, he was a partner in all this work. He was a DJ. He was a lawyer, but he was a DJ at the local African-American radio station at the time. And so he was telling everybody to come out. We had like 200 people there by 11 a.m. And all of a sudden, the pastors who had been in the civil rights movement and who had really done unbelievable work on these issues forever, they got all of us, they just spontaneously got us all in a big circle. And they said, here's what civil disobedience is, and here's what we're going to do, and here's what we need everybody else to do. And they literally held hands around the bulldozer, 12 of them, 12 pastors, and said, you will not tear down these houses. And of course, the police came out, they arrested those pastors. And on the front page of the Star Tribune the next day, there were 12 pastors with handcuffed being pushed in the cars on the front page of the Star Tribune the next day. But that day, you know, man, you want to fire up a community, arrest a pastor, right? By noon, by 1 o'clock, we had 400 people at the mayor's office downtown demanding that the mayor stop this biggest development process in the history of Minneapolis. Mayor comes out, Sharon Belton, and she puts a moratorium on the development. She stops it, right? And she turns to the Northside Neighbors for Justice, and she says, what the hell do y'all want? And the truth is, we didn't know, right? We had a list of demands. We know what we wanted to stop, but we didn't have a vision for really what we wanted that community to look like, right? And as we grabbed the power, we had all the power in the world right at that moment, but we didn't have the leadership. We didn't have the trust. I mean, hell, we were doing meetings in 5 languages, right? We didn't have the trust. We didn't have the network in place, and all of that began to crumble, right? Right after we got the power. Now, some good things happened. You know, affordable housing trust fund got in place, more money got happening. People got a chance to come back to the neighborhood. Affordable housing got over there. Some good things happened. We pushed out the city council member of that neighborhood. Some good things happened, but the truth is the infrastructure of leaders and organizations and networks were not in place to actually make that work effective. And I saw at that moment, I was like, one, I don't need to be an in-your-face organizer. It's not my style. It's not who I am. And number two, if somebody had been in those public housing units, building tenant councils, building leadership, bringing those tenant councils together to build trust and relationship and a vision for that community, we literally could have sat down as partners and could have shaped the whole development of that neighborhood. But because none of that capacity building had been done, none of that leadership development had been done, we were trying to do all of that and fight the city at the same time. Can't happen, right? And so I left that experience. I came back to North Carolina, started the Center for Participatory Change, and had one idea, and that was to support these grassroots leaders, to build leadership, to build organizations, and to build networks, and to have that work create daily change and create the infrastructure for that daily change to happen, but to also have that infrastructure in place when the big opportunities and big challenges come along so that we can actually grab the power and a seat at the table and be effective at it. So that's the long history. And that's the work ever since. I went from CPC to doing that at the national level at the Casey Foundation. I've been doing it at RSP ever since. But it's all that simple notion that in order to create change, you have to have infrastructure to do it. And somebody's got to be out building and strengthening and connecting that infrastructure for it to be successfit's
And Thomas, multiple points of that story. I got chills. I teared up a little bit, laughed a little bit. It's a gift to hear. So you're a very highly respected leader in Appalachia, and it's a gift to sort of hear the thought process, some of those key moments that shaped your thinking. That is fascinating to hear. I appreciate you so much sharing that.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride for sure, and I think it's just been the opportunity to, right people, right places, man, and people really helping to shape that next layer of thinking with me, as you continue to do with me now, right? I mean, it's same thing continues to happen.
So I got two more questions for you. A lot of your work, you've mentioned networks and the importance of networks. I think in some ways it's become a buzzword. It's like, it's a lot of people are like, yeah, of course we want to be a network, but I've really learned, I mean, it's an easier said than done type of situation.
Yeah.
You can have meetings and get a letterhead that says your network, or you can really learn how to be a network that gets good work done. So from your perspective, having been a part of several of them, how do you be a real network that gets good work done?
Yeah, many years ago, here in North Carolina, I was trying to start some networks. Same idea, theoretical. I knew we needed to work together, and I knew we needed to think together. And I'll never forget this moment. I was facilitating a big meeting here in Western North Carolina, trying to get a bunch of people to build a network. And I was up there talking about networks. And this woman stands up. There's probably 40, 50 people in the room, and this woman stands up, and this is her exact words. She says, "Thomas, I don't want to be part of no damn network. I got too much going on already. I got too many things happening, and I ain't got time for a network. What I want is I want to know everybody in this room well enough to where when I have a problem or if I need help, that I can call you up and you'll help me. That's what I want." And it really shaped everything about me. I'm like, that is it right there, right? That's the fundamental piece of what makes a network work. It is the trust and relationships, so that you can do easy work together, you can do hard work together, and you can stay together over the long term. But more importantly, it's that we know each other well enough in the network or out of the network that I can call you up and ask you for help. I feel that way with you, Brandon, because I've been in this network with you now for many years, right?
Absolutely.
And so if I didn't have that relationship, you wouldn't even answer my call. You ain't got time, right? But since I know you, I know that if I need you, I can call you up. And you're going to give me the time of day, and you're going to trust me enough to hear what I have to say, and you're going to care enough to actually do what you can to help me. And that's the fundamental foundational piece. And if that's not in place, then it just doesn't work. And that's where we see networks fall apart most of the time, is that people come together, they don't know each other, they don't have trust, they don't have a common vision, they don't have, the time together, and they try to do the hardest thing in the world, which is work together on very difficult and complicated problems, right? And so the main lesson, I think, in all of this network stuff is that you've got to take the time to build the trust and to build the relationships that then allow you to do good work and hard work over a long period of time. And to be able to sit down and talk through your differences or your similarities or whatever it is, that's the key to it all, I think.
Well, it's, and it's harder than it sounds. I mean, you say we got to build those trust and relationships. And in a sense, it is just spending time together, but, it's crowding out the distractions and being fully present for that time and learning how to be honest and direct, but still kind. And it's just easier said than done, isn't it?
It is. And, Leslie Schaller, A. Smith there, and part of CAN from the very beginning. I always quote her on this one. She says, we build relationships through, having coffee time and hanging out time and things like that. But we build trust by getting things done together, right? I trust you because I can count on you, and you're accountable to us. And so it is harder than it sounds. And, I always think about this in sort of the four C's, right? There's kind of four things that happens in a network, and they happen all the time in different ways, and they're always coming in and out. But, the simplest thing that happens in a network is just communication. We are better off just talking to each other, right? And learning from each other and figuring out what's happening. And then, once you start communicating with each other, you at least have enough to begin to coordinate some things, right? We can begin to think together about stuff, about what should happen, about our analysis, about, you can do this training on this day, I'll do it on that one. We can begin to coordinate some efforts so that we're not duplicating, so that we're building on stuff. But then you start moving to collaboration where we're actually sharing resources and we actually have to deeply depend on each other to get something done. Well, that's a whole different level, right? Because up until that point, we're still independent actors. We're just kind of coordinating what we're doing. Once you start collaborating, then you really and truly have to depend on each other to get it done. It won't happen without us. It's not just a me anymore. It's an us. And then the collective impact thing is even one step above that. That's, measurable goals. That's really where you have to have some backbone support to be able to facilitate the bigger movement of the group. And you're producing serious collaborative outcomes. And so, it takes time to move through those four C's, and they all happen at different phases and different ways in the network all the time. But the more you can move toward the collaborative stuff, the greater impact that you're going to have and the harder it is to do it.
Well, my final question is my standard question I like to ask all the guests. So what are some of the biggest changes you've seen in Appalachia during your time here? And then what are some big changes that you haven't seen yet, but you still hope to see?
Yeah. I think it's a lot of around what we've been talking about today is collaboration, coordination, working together. When the Funders Network started in 2010, I actually was blown away that it's a fairly small region, but almost none of the funders knew each other, and it just didn't make sense that they didn't know each other. Everybody kind of kept their head down and doing their own work. And so one of the biggest changes I've seen in the time that I've been working in Appalachia is that we're in alignment with each other. And there is so much work together that's happening. And this notion of working together in collaboration in whatever form that might be has really taken hold. I mean, there's a collaborative mindset. There's a collaborative spirit, I think, in Appalachia that didn't exist, even 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And there has been organizations and people like Leslie Schaller and Mason and others who have been, and Babcock who's been, promoting that notion for 30 years. And I think it's finally paying off. I think we are more and more headed down the same path toward a similar vision of a just and new economy in Central Appalachia. And I think that's some of the most exciting stuff for me. Our work is beginning to add up, not from its single parts, but for the collective of the whole. And I see it moving in some big ways. And that's critical to our future, as you know. And so we have more collaborative spirit. We have less working against, and we have many more people heading down the same path toward the same vision. That's exciting stuff. The big thing that has yet to happen is the scale on the economy that we need, right?
Yeah.
There's great economic development work that's happening all across the region. We are building these new sectors. I mean, you guys are leading this work, the local food sector, the clean energy sector, the reuse sector, the new manufacturing sector. All of those things have a lot of wind behind them. They're moving in lots of ways, but we've still got to scale it up so that the Thomas Watson that's coming out of high school in Carroll County today has a next step, whether they're going to college or not. They have a bridge to somewhere. They have a next step to do something so they can get themselves together to the point where they can do something else, whatever that might be, right? Our economy is still in our new economy is still in the formative stage, right? And so we've got to continue to work together across the region and turn these local and even, sub-regional economic development efforts into full-scale sectors that offer enough jobs and opportunities for folks so that our region moves forward. Without a job, you don't have a vision. Without a vision, you don't have dignity, you don't have purpose, and we're going to continue to stall. So it's going to take networks. It's going to take collaboration in order to do that. I see it. And it's hard work, and it's just going to take time.
That reminds me of Max and always sort of giving a reality check of this is going to be hard, expensive, time consuming. It's possible, but let's not diminish what we're up against.
I miss him so much, and he is so right.
Thomas, man, thank you for sharing your stories, your wisdom. Anybody who's a part of a network, I'm going to encourage to listen to this episode. Thanks for everything you've done for me, for Coalfield, for CAN, for Appalachia. It matters a lot, and we appreciate you.
Yeah, well, right back at you, Brandon. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure and an honor. And I'm just so excited to see your work continue to thrive and you really being on the cutting edge of, I think, what it takes to get the workforce back to work and to create these bridges that we've talked about throughout this podcast. So thank you. I'm honored to be here.